motion to leave.
Yeah, I'll just got a couple more minutes and let people keep coming in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for the manatee lesson, Ken.
Yep.
Alrighty, I'm impatient, so I'll go and get started with just my announcements. Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Zach Holmes. I'm in charge of evening programs and on the board for Alachua Audubon Society. We're really excited that you're here to join us today, even given our postponement. So thanks for being flexible, everybody. I know we have a really great talk ahead of us. So just a couple announcements from Alachua Audubon side. This weekend we have a big event called Pints and Predators. It's at First Magnitude Brewing Company. It's their 10th annual event. So if you have time on Saturday after 10 a.m. and interested in visiting and seeing some cool birds and participating in a cool conservation event, I encourage you all to stop by. The first weekend of March is also the Florida Ornithological Society's annual meeting, which is going to actually be here in Gainesville this spring. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about avian conservation work and avian work in general, both from graduate students and professionals in the field, feel free to research that online at fos.org and register to attend the event. Most of the talks are happening on Saturday afternoon, and including a banquet and a keynote address. And field trips will be happening all weekend. So stay tuned on that. Our next evening program is not going to happen until April 4th, where we'll be talking about birding in Ecuador. So stay tuned for that announcement. Right. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to announce our speaker this evening is Chris Benesh. He originally grew up in California and is a world-renowned and amazing field guide leader for trips all over the world, mostly Central America, if I'm right. But he's here today to talk to us about flycatchers. And I know that we have seen several different species of flycatchers, including some rare ones here in Alachua County, especially on our Christmas bird count. So I'm really excited to have him here to dive into flycatchers in general, which are tricky for a lot of us. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Chris.
Right. Hey, everybody. Thank you for the invite. And again, sorry for missing the January date. I'm glad that you all could make it for the February one. So Zach and I, let's see, get started on this thing here. Yeah, Zach and I, when we were first talking about setting this up, we were thinking about putting something together that was focused on some of the birds that show up in the fall and winter in your area there in Alachua County. And so I got to looking at eBird and then when talking to Zach, sort of came up with a few different things that are sort of topical that I thought would be worth covering. So typically you have one or two of each of these sorts of flycatchers, groups of flycatchers that are the sort of expected bird in late fall and winter. And then you have more rarely some similar looking thing that shows up and is potentially causing confusion. And so I thought that we would just look at each of these groups, starting with the kingbirds. We'll start in sort of the reverse order that you see of these arrows here. But sort of Western kingbird is the scarce but sort of expected wintertime kingbird. But then you also have the potential to have a tropical type kingbird show up, or Cassin's kingbird occasionally showing up in the late fall and winter. So we'll talk about those, and then we'll move into the Maorcas flycatchers. You've got your great crested flycatcher, and then we'll draw some comparisons with a couple other things that potentially can show up in your area as well. And then finally, we'll move into some of the tricky and pitanax flycatchers, and that will sort of wrap up with those. So the first couple segments are going to be, these are actually videos that were put together for our outbirding series that we put together during COVID and stuff. So there's a little bit of passive watching some of these things, and then after each little section, we'll do a little follow up with questions if you guys have some specific things to follow up on. So, anyways, again, we'll start with. Can you guys see the entire screen, or are you getting the panel on the right there? Not sure if I need to.
We can see you and the presentation. Would you like to change that?
Well, you can see just me. I'm seeing the whole panel of anyways, this should work.
Okay.
Yeah, so start out with the Tyrannus kingbirds, all the kingbirds in the genus Tyrannus. And basically you have several different very confusing yellow-bellied ones that are and so this is a little video presentation that will sort of cover the topic of kingbirds.
Let's start with our most common and widespread of the yellow-bellied kingbirds in North America, the western kingbird. Western kingbirds are primarily a western North American species, as the name implies, but western kingbird can show up absolutely anywhere in North America. Besides being very common along roadsides in the vast open country of the West, western kingbirds are scarce but regular fall migrants along the east coast of the U.S. and even winter regularly in small numbers in South Florida. This species is turned up in every state of the Union except for Hawaii, and has shown up in almost every Canadian province, and it's clearly the most likely yellow-bellied kingbird to appear across the continent. It makes a lot of sense to learn this one well, and then use it as a baseline in comparison to other yellow-bellied kingbirds. The first overall impression of western kingbird is that it's a slim, horizontally postured pale kingbird with an obvious yellow belly. All of the field guides out there drill into birders' heads the fact that western kingbird has a mostly black tail with a thin white outer web to the outermost tail feather. This is clearly a very good field mark to use in the field to identify this kingbird, but the tail isn't always especially conspicuous on a perched bird. Other similar kingbird species can fool an observer if there's strong sunlight shining through the folded tail of a perched bird, making the outer web of the outer tail feather look white or very pale. The lesson here is to never rely on a single field mark to identify a kingbird, or any bird for that matter. A little scrutiny of a perched bird shows a very pale gray head with a faint, darker gray mask around the eyes and extending backwards from the lores onto the ear coverts. But this mask is often quite narrow and ill-defined and contrasts weakly with the paler sides of the head. The back is pale gray, usually with an overlay of pale greenish, especially in freshly molted birds. The wings are quite dark with pale fringing to the wing coverts and tertials, and the overall wing contrasts strongly with the pale back. The underparts are mostly bright yellow from the undertail coverts up to the mid-breast, fading to white on the upper breast and onto the throat. The malar region just below the lower edge of the poorly defined dark mask is usually quite bright white, contrasting with both the darker mask and the slightly less white sides of the throat. This is a pattern that's shared with, but is much more evident on, a similar Cassin's kingbird. The tail, along with the upper tail coverts, is indeed black, much blacker than any other kingbird in North America, and contrasts strongly with the pale upper parts. When seen from below in flight, the very black tail contrasts with the underparts more than other yellow-bellied kingbirds, even the similarly dark-tailed Cassins, and especially so when compared to tropical couches and thick-billed kingbirds. The bill is all black and rather short for a kingbird, but it often appears longer than that of the similar Cassins. Voice is also a very important character to note if your bird happens to be calling, and it's unlike any other yellow-bellied kingbird species. Cassin's kingbird has a more restricted range in the west, and it doesn't seem to have the same propensity to wander that western has, but it occasionally wanders some to the east coast and the Gulf Coast Florida region. Birders seem to confuse Cassins and western kingbirds quite a bit, but we'll show you that they're really quite different from one another. Like the western kingbird, Cassins has a very dark tail, which contrasts strongly with the back and wings when viewed from behind on perch birds, and with the yellow underparts of birds in flight when viewed from below. The tail tips on most Cassins are pale brownish buff, imparting a look that's vaguely similar to eastern kingbird's tail, but the tail tips on Cassins are never as contrasting as that species. The tail, though, isn't the first thing that we usually look at on kingbirds, since angle, wear, age, and lighting can affect your impression so much. The first thing to look at on a suspected Cassins is the head, face, and upper breast. Cassins has a much darker gray head, fully one shade darker than western at any age, and the bright white malar chin area on Cassins really gleams when contrasted against the very dark gray head and upper breast. When viewed from below, the yellow in the underparts extends up to mid-breast, but it then transitions to dark gray across the upper breast, sides of the head, and lower throat. Another useful feature to look at is that the wings don't contrast with the back, which is only slightly paler than the dark gray head, as much as they do on adult western kingbird. This is due primarily to the extensive pale edging to the wing coverts, tertials, and flight feathers. This feature is less useful when compared to juvenile western kingbird, which shows extensive pale edging to the wing coverts and tertials, reducing the contrast between the wings and back. The bill of Cassins, like western, is all black and is moderately sized, though it often looks shorter billed in the field than western. Voice, as with all of our kingbirds, is very important, and Cassin's common calls are an easy way to ID this kingbird once the observer is familiar with the vocalizations. There are a couple more finer points that can be used to separate some of the trickier individuals that fall into the western Cassin's bin. There's a difference in the length of the pale malar in these species. On western kingbird, the malar sweeps back well past the eye and curls into the ear coverts, while the pale malar of Cassin's kingbird stops abruptly under the eye. Also, adult kingbirds, and males in particular, have distinctive modified outer primary tips that are highly notched. The resulting feather shape of western kingbird resembles a saber. That of Cassin's kingbird is more sawtooth-like.
It is worthwhile to discuss the importance of age with respect to kingbird identification. So far, we have covered the two more widespread yellow-bellied species in the United States. Before moving on to other species, I wanted to mention how birds in juvenile and formative plumage differ from the adults, and how that can complicate the identification. Juveniles are generally paler in coloration, smaller build, and have prominent, often rusty-edged wing coverts as fresh juveniles. The head often shows a distinct pale brow, and the white of the throat can be more extensive than on the adults. The primary tips of juveniles are gently rounded, lacking the distinctive shapes found on adults. Here is a young western kingbird that exhibits a pale brow and more extensive white throat than is found on the adult. The head of this Cassin's kingbird is only slightly paler than that of the adult, but note how the edgings on the wing coverts have distinct cinnamon tones. Here we have a nice comparison of two western kingbirds, a paler frosted looking juvenile on the left and a darker adult on the right. Notice the prominent edgings on the tertials and visible primaries on the juvenile bird. The last two species that we will discuss are visually quite similar and often confused for one another. Thankfully, vocally they are very distinctive. The first of the two, tropical kingbird, is an extremely wide-ranging species, and as its name suggests, it occurs at lower elevations through much of the tropics. At the northern edge of its range, the species is a breeder in Arizona and in recent decades, southernmost Texas. Some populations are highly migratory, and the species has shown up in many places in North America. In Arizona, the species is closely tied to areas with water sources surrounded by trees, such as stock ponds, rivers, and sewage treatment plants. In South Texas, the species favors lightly wooded areas. Compared to western kingbird, this species is distinctive in a couple of noticeable ways. The combination of a long bill, short primary projection, and a long tail give this species a rather elongated appearance. Compare that to a western kingbird, which is relatively short-billed, longer-winged, and relatively short-tailed, resulting in a more compact aspect. Tropical kingbirds average the longest build of any yellow-bellied kingbird. They have a light gray head with the diffuse darker mask running through the lores back past the eyes. The upper parts are generally greener in coloration than western, and the wings paler, and with more prominent pale fringing to the wing coverts. Importantly, unlike western and cassins, the tail is paler and brownish, and does not contrast with the wings and body like in those two species. The tail often appears notched. This can be a potential indicator of a tropical kingbird or couches, though other kingbird species can give the impression of a notched tail due to feather molt or wear. The color of the tail is more important than whether a notch exists. Tropical has less grayish olive and more yellow on the chest than western, and the throat is much more extensively white. The voice of tropical kingbird is unlike any of the other yellow-bellied species, consisting of a series of 2 or more sharp metallic notes often run together in a trill. Juveniles differ from adults, as with other species, in having a paler eyebrow and rusty fringed wing coverts and upper tail coverts, along with a shorter bill. Next, we will discuss the identification of Couch's kingbird. You will likely be feeling a bit of deja vu, thinking, haven't we already covered this one? Couch's is extremely similar to tropical kingbird, and identification by sight alone is fraught with doubt, as there is considerable overlap between the two species. Couch's kingbird is a bird of the lowlands, framing the Gulf of Mexico. In recent years, it has been expanding its range northward farther into Texas and eastward towards Louisiana. It wanders less than tropical, but has occurred as far west as California and Arizona, and east to the Atlantic coast and as far north as Michigan. These species are so similar visually that they were considered the same species for many years, until Irby Davis noted in the 1960s that they had very different vocalizations. Melvin Traylor Jr. published his research on these populations in the Auk in 1979, concluding that 2 species were involved. The AOU split them in 1983. Some of the shortest billed couches are likely identifiable visually, and usually the longest billed tropicals are too. Couch's bills average slightly thicker in depth than tropical, and generally shorter in length, though there is overlap. A recent individual detected in Arizona was extremely long-billed, and its identification could only be confirmed by voice. Traylor's research with museum specimens described couches as being slightly larger than tropical, shorter billed, with less gray and more yellow on the back, and being paler in the wings and tail. The contact call of this species is a short kip note, much like a western kingbird, but it also mixes it with queer notes that are diagnostic. The juveniles resemble juvenile tropical kingbirds, having pale eyebrows and rusty-edged wing coverts. Because these two species are so similar visually, it is worth taking a moment to review the vocal differences between them. In the following recording and spectrogram visualization, you will first hear tropical kingbird's staccato metallic trilled vocalization. In the second part, you hear Couch's kingbird giving its very different kip and queer calls. Voice remains the best way to differentiate between these two very similar species.
Let's take a second to look back at each of these yellow-bellied species. Western kingbird is the palest with the blackest tail and contrasty wings, as well as having that characteristic white outer webbing to its outermost tail feather. Cass's is the charcoal-colored one with a contrasty dark tail, but lacking much contrast between the wings and back. The dark head really makes the white chin and malar pop. Tropical kingbird is the colorful, lanky species with the longest bill, pale brownish notched tail, and distinctive trilled vocalization. Couch's kingbird looks like a slightly stubbier billed tropical kingbird with a really different voice.
Okay, so that's sort of an overview of the yellow-bellied kingbirds. Does anybody have any follow-on questions?
And feel free to put your questions either in the chat or raise your hand, and I can call on you for any of our kingbirds. I'll start us off, Chris. So
Yeah,
here at
sure.
Alachua County, western kingbirds are probably the most popular or most seen, as shown in the eBird summary. Are they associated with like a certain habitat or land cover type during their non-breeding season?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, Florida's sort of represents like the northern extreme of their range, right? There's some of them that go all the way down into the sort of northern tier of South America. So you know, they typically are birds of open country. Of all the kingbirds that we just discussed, they're the ones most likely to be seen in, relatively open types of habitats. And also a lot of kingbirds and flycatchers in general avail themselves of fruit in the wintertime. So if there's some, fruiting bursaras or gumbo limbos and those sorts of things, they'll often be associated with those kinds of trees.
Thanks. Thomas just made a comment that says vocalizations rule ultimately.
Ultimately, for sure. Absolutely, especially with the the tropical couches pair. There's, as I alluded to, there's some subtle things that I think you can tell some of the extremes, but when I'm birding in parts of Mexico and Belize and stuff where you have couches and tropicals together, it's fun to sort of play the game of, name that silent kingbird initially, and then try to coax it into vocalizing so you can, confirm your your identification one or another, and probably right about 70% of the time, So.
All right. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I think we can keep going.
Okay. All right. So yeah, so from this group, we'll move on to the Mayorkas flycatchers. And again, there's sort of two pieces. The first is sort of a little brief how to look at Myarchus flycatchers, and then the second little bit will be covering the specific species. So without further ado, oops.
Telling Myarchus apart can be a real challenge, but there are a few things to focus on. Brown-crested is the largest and biggest build of the Myarchus. Dusky-capped is the smallest and slimmest of them. Great-crested flycatcher is a long-distance migrant and has pointier wings and thus longer primary projection than brown-crested flycatcher, which is a short-distance migrant. The central tail feathers of adult Myarchus are all brown in color, but the outermost tail feathers of adults differ between species, and examining the pattern of the underside of the outermost tail feather can often be an important clue to the identification. This, however, is not the case for juvenile birds. Most juvenile birds have extensively rufous-colored tail feathers, and this includes the central pair. Also, focusing on the degree of contrast between the primaries and secondaries, as well as the boldness of the wing coverts, can yield important clues. Finally, overall coloration and intensity of color are important identification clues. Great-crested flycatcher. One of the first things to notice about great-crested flycatcher is its name. Notice it is not hyphenated. It is a crested flycatcher, and it is a great one, but its crest is not particularly great. The species is often less crested appearing than the similar brown-crested and ash-throated species. Great-crested is big and colorful. It is the most richly colored and contrasty of all the species that occur in the United States. Its yellow belly is the brightest, the gray head and breast the darkest gray, and the back is more strongly olive-toned than any of the species. It is also a long-distance migrant, with birds wintering in southernmost Mexico, Central America, and northwestern South America. Because of this, it is longer-winged than the rest of the Myarchus, and that is evident with its longer primary projection. Another distinctive pattern shown by this species is the pattern of the tertial edgings. These are the innermost three secondaries in passerines, and Myarchus show bold, pale edgings to these feathers. What makes great-crested distinctive here is the innermost, or upper, tertial has a thick wedge-shaped edge, noticeably bolder than that of other Myarchus, making it an important character if seen. Adult great-crested shows strong contrast between the rufous-edged primaries and yellowish-white-edged secondaries. This pattern is typical of the larger species: great-crested, brown-crested, and ash-throated. Adult great-crested have largely rufous-colored tails. Examining the underside of the outermost tail feather shows it to be almost entirely rufous, with just a pale narrow streak of brown along the feather shaft. The most characteristic call of this species is a loud whistled weep note that is drawn out and variable in pitch. A second commonly given call is a whistle rattled breet call. Brown-crested flycatcher. This is a wide-ranging species that occurs in the United States in two distinct populations. The southwest population, Magister, is the largest of the Myarchus. The smaller subspecies, Cooperi, is smaller billed and more likely to be confused with ash-throated and great-crested. Neither population of brown-crested is as colorful as a great-crested, and both are shorter winged, exhibiting a short primary projection. Brown-crested are bushy-crested birds, often more so than great-crested. They are paler-headed and paler-breasted than great-crested, overall a bit more washed out. They lack the distinctive tertial pattern of great-crested, with all of the tertial edgings appearing similarly wide. The adult tail pattern is much like great-crested, but with a bit more brown evident along the shaft of the feather. The dawn song of this species is a characteristic whit-will-do. Common daytime calls include a heavy whit note and a raspy breer call, the latter often run into a long series. Ash-throated flycatcher. This is the most widespread species of Myarchus in the West. It occurs in all but the moistest habitats, and unlike brown-crested flycatcher, is not as restricted in its nesting requirements. Ash-throated is a medium-sized species, smaller than both great-crested and brown-crested. It is also the palest of the regularly occurring species, with rather faint yellowish belly and pale dorsally. Compared with brown-crested, ash-throated has a pointier bill that is less swollen in appearance. This difference is particularly noticeable in Arizona, where the larger-billed brown-crested occur. Adult ash-throated flycatchers in fresh plumage have distinctive patterned tail feathering. Examining the outermost tail feather from below reveals this distinct pattern. The brown part of the feather expands in width near the tip of the tail, such that the entire tip of the feather is brown. This is unlike the pattern of brown-crested and great-crested, where the rufous coloration extends all the way down to the tip of the feather. Beware of really worn adults, where the entire tip of the feather may have worn away, obscuring the pattern. The common daytime phrases of this species are cabrick and cabreer calls. Also a short, dry-sounding pip note. This species also gives a series of trilled notes that drop in pitch. Lasagras flycatcher. Lasagras is an infrequent visitor to southern Florida from the Bahamas and Cuba, where it is native. It is a small to medium-sized species and drabber than any of the other species that we have discussed so far. This species can be found alongside great-crested flycatcher in the early spring, but it is in the winter months that birders often have trouble separating Lasagras from ash-throated flycatcher, as the latter is a scarce wintering bird in South Florida. The structure of this species is somewhat variable. Most appear big-headed and short-billed, but some individuals are distinctly longer-billed. Birds from the Bahamas, lucasiensis, are a bit more colorful than the Cuban subspecies sagre. This is most evident in their having a slight yellowish wash to the belly and more rufous coloration in the tail. With adult Cuban birds, the ventral surface of the outer tail feather is essentially all brown, with just a very narrow fringing of rufous on the inner web. The outermost tail feather of adult Bahamian birds is variable, but typically has about 30 to 40% of the inner web rufous, with the remaining parts brown, as in this image. Note the blended effect with the gradual transition from rufous to brown. A small percentage of birds have outermost tail feathers patterned like Cuban birds, but the adjacent feather, number 5, will still show extensive rufous. The overall effect of the species is one that is brownish above and off-whitish below, with a dull-colored tail and reasonably bold whitish wing bars and noticeably rufous-edged primaries. This species utters a variety of call, all distinctly higher pitched than those of great-crested flycatcher. Calls include a strident whistled overslurred weet, a slightly doubled pew-it note, These are sometimes paired as a wee pewt in the manner of an ash-throated cabric call. Other calls include a high, dry, rapid trill, a slower, more musical, overslurred rattle, as well as short wit or pit notes at times given in a series.
All right, so that's a little overview of the Mallorcas, plus I tossed in the Sagres for those who run down to the lower part of the state to look for those in the wintertime. So yeah, so questions about that? Again, ash-throated is a bird that has a tendency to wander, particularly notably in like late October into November and December. And they have what's known as a molt migration, where they will often first appear somewhere when they're still largely in juvenile plumage, and then transition from that into the formative plumage, which is extensive in America. So they'll drop a lot of the secondaries, and a lot of the tail feathers will drop as well. So they'll develop over the course of the winter months, the sort of adult-like tail pattern.
Yeah, so if anybody has questions, feel free to raise your hand or pop things into the chat. I'll start us off again. So for us in Alachua County, it's winter time. We know it's not going to be a great crested, most likely due to the time of year. What are kind of your first steps on and it's a Mallorcas. What are your first steps as a birder to try to identify between, I think for the most part, it's going to be between, brown crested and ash throated here
Yeah.
in the winter.
Yes. So I've been looking at some of the images of Florida's brown-crested flycatchers, and surprisingly to me, a lot of them actually look more like Western birds. They look pretty large billed, and I don't know if that's sort of the impression that you guys typically get. But so again, what I would do is I would try to make an assessment about like what the age of the bird is. In other words, is it still, has it revealed its adult tail pattern? Especially essentially looking at the undersurface of that outermost tail feather. Because again, in ash-throated flycatcher, you're going to have a nice sort of broadening right at the tip of the tail feather, so that the entire tip of the tail feather is going to have sort of a comma of brown on it, versus like with brown crested, you're going to have essentially the brown starting way up at the base of the feather and running down the entire length of the shaft as sort of an even width, strip. But the tip of that outermost tail feather will be largely rufous with just the brown right around the shaft. So trying to get a look at the sort of general impression of the bird. Does it feel, large build, sort of swollen build and bulky-ish? And then trying your best to get a look at the undertail. Because coloration wise, in the wintertime, brown crested are probably slightly more colorful than ash throateds, but they both are sort of on the duller side of the spectrum in terms of, richness or saturation of color. If that helps or not, but
yeah. Very
yeah,
cool.
brown cresteds typically too, they typically hang out in slightly taller, more dense vegetation too. That there's huge overlap, but they're less likely to be found in really open situations.
Very cool. All right, I don't see any other questions up yet. If you do have any other questions about this, we'll have time at the end too. So let's keep going.
Okay, cool. All right. So from here, we'll sort of move on to talking about some of the Empinonax flycatchers. And again, my interpretation of the data there is that you have like small numbers of least flycatchers that spend the winter there and are detected in the wintertime. And also yellow-bellied flycatcher is occasionally detected through the winter months. And then on top of that, you have the potential for some Western things to show up. You have what's now sort of thankfully just known as Western flycatcher that has a propensity to wander to the east in the cooler fall winter months. And of those, I think the vast majority have proven to be what we used to call up until recently Pacific slope flycatcher. So we'll talk about how to compare. And then on top of that, there is also another lookalike of the least flycatcher, Hammond's flycatcher, which also has a tendency to wander to the east in the fall and winter. So I'll talk a little bit about the differences in sorting out that least flycatcher, Hammond's flycatcher pair, and then talk about yellow-bellied flycatcher and how to begin to approach separating that from Western flycatcher, and then mention briefly Acadian flycatcher in the mix as well. Okay. So sorting through Pennax flycatchers, we have least flycatcher here. Least flycatcher is, in my mind, sort of the daintiest, sort of dingiest, least featured, features of the Pennax flycatchers. It has sort of a shortish tail, sort of short to moderate wings, a stubby bill, and it tends to not be particularly colorful. So before we dive into this, I did want to make mention that there are actually some really cool references that are coming along the pike here. So this is a plug for one that's already out, which these two guys, Sintai Lee and Andrew Birch, did a wonderful job sort of tackling a couple of these really challenging groups. But for Pennax flycatchers, you probably couldn't do any better than Newfield Guide, because they talk a lot about some of the features that you want to be looking for when you're looking at a Pennax. So basically they're all sort of little green to brownish jobs, but they do differ subtly in the lengths of their tails, the lengths of their wings, the size and length of their bills, and then how much contrast there is to the wings, how bold the wing bars are, those sorts of things. Anyways, this book does a really good job of sort of putting together a lot of the different variables that one should be considering when trying to tackle identifying an Pennax. But least flycatcher, let's see if I can get my little laser pointer thing going here for this. So least flycatcher, in my mind, again, is sort of what I would consider sort of the daintiest of the Pennax flycatchers. And to my eye, at least, some Pennax look very delicate, and some of them, like I would put Acadian flycatcher sort of at the other extreme, look very sturdy, very stocky, thick, thick-bodied, broad-tailed. They have a big stout bill. So when I'm looking at a Pennax, I try to get an impression of their overall sort of structure. And least flycatcher is, from my mind, sort of contrasty, often has a very brownish wash to it. The wings tend to be fairly bold. The primary projection is sort of, medium, I would say. It's not typically looking super long-winged. And then sort of this semi-broad based, but pretty stubby little bill. That's kind of the overall impression that I get of these guys. Here's just a few examples of that. Nice little eye ring. The eye ring is fairly bold, and it's typically whitish. So there's a lot of contrast between that eye ring on a darker face. Again, the bill shortish, essentially all pale on the mandible. And then again, that sort of slightly almost pot-bellied look, and with the short but narrow tail. In Belize. Again, the tail, you can see it's pretty worn. This is an adult that hasn't replaced his tail yet. But that very sort of narrow, shortish impression is what you're after with this guy. Stubby bill, shortish tail. Another example, this is a bird that's has just molted his tail in the late summer actually in Arizona, sort of a stray out west. But again, sort of a little rounded head, little stubbyish bill, often, a little bit of a buffy, yellowy kind of wash to the underparts, but not particularly yellowish. And often sort of very brownish looking dorsally. And again, sort of just medium, short to medium in terms of its primary length, primary projection, but nice crisp edgings to the tertials, these pale whitish edgings, and fairly bold whitish wing bars, so that wing panel stands out as often like the most contrasty part of the bird that you're looking at. Here's a spring bird that really shows the essence of how bold the wing panel can look. There's nice crisp edges to the tertial feathers here. And again, sort of medium primary projection. And when I'm looking at primary projection in general, what I'm doing is I like to compare this length here, which is the length of the exposed tertials, to the distance that the primary tips project past the tip of the longest tertial. So, and that will vary. So it's sort of look-alike is the Hammond's flycatcher. And Hammond's flycatcher is structurally, in terms of its tail length and sort of overall body size, very similar to a least flycatcher. It tends to often have a little bit more of a peaked crown than least flycatchers tend to have. And it's usually more colorful, and particularly in having more sort of olive and yellowish tones to. And in the west here, Hammond's flycatcher is the Impedinax that's most likely to be confused with a kinglet, believe it or not, because it has such that, the bill is relatively fine and pointy. And while many are not this way, it often looks like it has an entirely dark bill. This is an example of one that does. Okay, so here's one in profile. And one of the couple things to notice about it is it tends to not have quite as bold a wing panel as the least flycatcher, but in particular has more sort of olivey gray sort of coloration to the underpart, so that there tends to be less contrast between the dark on the back and the underparts. There tends to be sort of more even toned throughout, whereas least flycatcher, in most impressions, has sort of that paler, almost whitish to pale yellowish look below, with a sort of darker brownish to olive brownish colored upperparts. Again, that sort of tiny little pointy beak on it as well. But one of the things to notice that this one shows really well is that Hammond's flycatcher, unlike least flycatcher, has quite long primary projection. So again, looking at the sort of exposed tertial length and comparing that to the exposed primary length, there you can see that Hammond's flycatcher is quite a long-winged Impedinax. And that's something that will be very noticeable to one in the field when if you're able to watch it long enough and see, particularly to assess it from either a good sort of profile angle, or from from the back, whatever, you'll get this impression of a really long winged look to it. And so here they are side by side. And of course, again, to echo the comment earlier, vocalizations rule. And so they actually thankfully have very different sounding voices. Least Flycatcher has a very sharp pit call that it gives. And Hammond's Flycatcher has a very distinctive peak note. And you can see in the spectrogram here, it's actually an overslur, sort of an inverted V appearance to it, but I'll let you hear them here. Oops, there we go. There. Peak, pit versus the peak. So those are two, but you can see these two both, if you look at the image at the top there, they're both somewhat similar in structure, narrow-tailed, sort of, skinny-bodied, big-headed, differ a little bit in their bill structure. These flycatchers a little bit sort of stubbier, broader build, but easily confused with one another. And then so on to yellow-bellied flycatcher, which I gather is the flycatcher most likely to be found in the late fall and winter, overwintering. And so it's the species that I will start with. It's a bird that breeds in the boreal forest, across the Canadian Arctic and up into a bit of central Alaska even. And most of them winter in southern Mexico and northern Central America. And basically, compared to least flycatcher, yellow-bellied flycatcher is a much more sort of uniformly colored, slightly larger build flycatcher. And sort of classic look of yellow-bellied is to have an all pale orange mandible and to have a relatively sort of uniform olive yellowy wash to the upper parts, a nice crisp, well-defined eye ring, and sort of paler but relatively uniform wash of yellow to the underparts. Slightly paler throat, but typically not particularly whitish in coloration. Another example, this is the one where it shows a little bit of flaring to the eye, which can invite confusion with Western flycatcher. But so that field mark, the crescent, post-ocular crescent look of Western flycatcher is not a 100% foolproof kind of thing. You want to look at a couple other features here. One of which is that yellow-bellied has typically a crisper, bolder wing panel. Like the whites are white, the darks are dark, so that the contrast between the two, the feather, the tipping on the wing coverts and the edging on the tertials sort of really pops. And another feature that is suggestive of yellow-bellied too, which is shown well here, is contrast between the edges of the primaries and the secondaries here. This little stack right in here, those are the secondaries. And then the secondaries have a nice sort of pale whitish or dull yellow, pale yellowish edgings to them, and the primaries don't. So there's a nice sort of contrast between those two feather groups. Also, I'll point this out in another slide, but if you look at the primary tipping, which is probably hard to see in this individual slide, there's a subtle difference between this and Western flycatcher in terms of the primary spacing. Yellow-bellieds tend to have a couple sort of eyes, whereas Western has typically one large gap and then a couple smaller gaps adjacent to it. It's another example of yellow-bellied flycatcher. Again, relatively uniform, sort of, dark olive yellow above. The throat is not particularly contrasty, say compared to a least flycatcher, which, has that sort of hooded look and then a pale throat look to it. This looks like a bird in sort of late summer, so it's a little bit more sort of worn. Okay, so contrast that with Western flycatcher. So this is a Western flycatcher that actually showed up in Cape May. So they have a tendency to wander, and there now are a number of documented records of particularly what used to be called Pacific slope flycatcher, all up and down the East Coast. And they are very, very similar to yellow-bellied flycatcher. They tend to be slightly more crested in appearance, typically overall. And most notably, they tend to show a duller wing panel. So again, lacking the sort of bold black and white appearances of the yellow-bellieds. Again, it's like, it's something that you need to sort of be cautious with, because, the ambient lighting situation that you're observing the birds in can really sort of affect that somewhat dramatically and whatnot. But they typically have this little bit of a flared, post-ocular, pinch behind the eye. And again, like yellow-bellied, they have a nice broad base to the bill and an entirely pale sort of orangey yellow mandible. They tend to be a little bit larger build than yellow-bellied flycatcher, but there's overlap there. This is another example of one that, that shows that that sort of post-ocular bit behind the eye can be not particularly obvious. But if you look here, you'll see that the wing panel is not as bold as on the yellow-bellied. And I mentioned the differences in the sort of the secondaries and primaries. You can see there's some contrast, but it's perhaps not as pronounced as it was on the yellow-bellied. It's another example. This is a young bird that has, still kind of rounded, pale-tipped primaries. Probably on average, Westerns are a little bit longer tailed relative to yellow-bellied as well. So a little bit less compact in shape. And then here is, here's a close-up of the primary spacing that I was referring to. So on the left here is yellow-bellied. So this is pretty subtle, but there's a couple sort of gaps here, and here, this distance and this distance that are roughly equal on these guys. And if you look at a Western flycatcher, you can see there's like a small gap and then a very large gap, and then another sort of almost no gap kind of thing. So if you were able to get some really good photos, especially, you might be able to document the primary spacing as a feature, as an identification feature. So Western would have this sort of irregular spacing that resulted in one, very big gap between primaries versus a more even two gaps of sort of even length. And then once again, if you're lucky and can hear them vocalizing, there are some differences. There's a few different calls that are given by yellow-bellied flycatcher, and some of the ones that are given in the wintertime are not typically things you hear on the breeding grounds. Like this last call here in particular is a very common call to hear on their winter grounds. So the calls here of, these sort of peak and poop calls are a little bit sort of more tonal and musical, lower pitched. You see they occupy lower frequency band than the calls, similar calls of the Western. And Western calls typically involve these are given names, which are a little bit misnomers, but there's like a female position note and a male position note. And they're actually calls that are given by both sexes, so that, but in early research days, it was thought that the females gave this high, thin little seep note, and that the males gave this up, this slurred position note. So I'm gonna play this one more time so you can hear the difference there. Oops, try this again. Nope. Here we go. So ideally, you want to hang out with them for a long period of time and hope that you eventually hear them vocalizing. All right, and so the last one that sort of falls into this group a little bit, I gather it's something in your area that you could get a bird, sort of a late Acadian that hasn't moved south yet, when you are potentially in the window for getting your first yellow-bellied flycatcher. So sort of wanted to contrast those guys a little bit. And to my eye, whereas yellow-bellied and least, Hammonds, and Western all sort of fall into this somewhat more delicate, dainty flycatcher group. To my eye, Acadian flycatcher is a relatively stocky, sturdy impedinax. It's sort of in the group with the willow and alder. They're larger birds, sort of thicker tail. The whole body tends to be thicker, and an Acadian flycatcher is the longest winged of any of the impedinax flycatchers as well. So tends to be large billed. Not only is the bill long, but it also is somewhat thicker and blunter tipped than sort of the pointier beak of a yellow-bellied flycatcher. And there tends to be more contrast between the upper parts and the underparts on these guys. And the head has sort of a distinctive shape too. It tends to be less rounded, but has a little bit more of a sloped look to it, sort of a, steep forehead look to it. And the eye ring typically is relatively thin but very crisp and pops on the dark face of the bird. This is another. This is one spring migrant, and it's often they actually hold their wings sort of droopy like this bird is doing here, but you can get an impression of, like, again, the tertial length here to what would be the equivalent of this primary length. Very, very long winged, and again, heavy build, sort of a little bit more contrast in the face. The throat is pale, and in fact, the underparts tend to be more sort of very, very pale yellowish to whitish compared to the sort of more even yellowy coloration of yellow-bellied. So looking for more contrast in the face, the cap versus the paler throat on these Acadians, and more contrast between the darker upper parts and paler underparts on Acadian. But again, like for me, like what strikes me is this sort of thick, stocky, tough looking flycatcher. And these guys have, the yellow-bellied will have these distinctive notes here, these first three kinds of notes, and then, but they both have a peak note, which is quite similar to one another. They typically are higher pitched, as in this example in the Acadian flycatcher, but if you just hear that one note, it's easy to get tripped up, because to my ear they sound pretty similar. But if you look again at the pictures here, you can sort of get the impression of a relatively delicate, dainty looking yellow-bellied versus a sort of robust, thick-bodied broad-tailed Acadian. So anyways, let's see if we can do the voices on these guys. Okay. All right, and just a quick comments about where these things might be apt to show up. Like, Acadian flycatchers, in my experience, ironically, it's the Impedinax I see least often. I see them in the wintertime in Panama mostly, and in the springtime in Texas. And I always find that they are in pretty tall, pretty dense wooded areas, and can often be a little bit tricky to spot because they're often sort of, just buried somewhere back in the woods. Yellow-bellied is also a bird that likes to spend a lot of time in kind of wooded areas. Whereas like least flycatcher, I tend to see that most often in relatively open situations, lower, sort of more open vegetation, scrubbier sort of situations. I know they breed in some, pretty tall broadleaf forests in some places, but they seem to be the species that's most apt to be in kind of pretty open settings and stuff. And then Hammond's flycatcher, a migrant or a wintering bird might occur just about anywhere, but I would be guessing that many of them would show up in places that also are fairly wooded and provide some good cover. They tend to like sort of cooler, shadier places to hang out in. So with that, any questions?
Wow. Thank you. That was very informative and really excellent pictures. So are there any other behavioral differences in terms of like foraging techniques at all between any of the Epidnex?
Well, the challenging part with foraging for me is that, how these things forage is often dependent on like what the ambient temperatures are. So if it's like in the cool winter months, on a really cool day, almost any Epidnex will get right on down near the ground. So you'll see them, things even like Hammond's flycatcher. Typically, I'd say all of the four that I discussed would normally kind of forage in sort of mid-height sort of situations, doing lots of, gleaning. But on cold days, everything drops down to the ground, and or on perches just a few feet off the ground, and will actually often do little pounce forays. They'll spot something, spider or something moving on the ground, and actually dip down right onto the ground, grab it, and then fly back up to just because those areas might tend to be a little bit a little micro warmth that might occur right near the ground. And then as the sun warms up, of course, the treetops, if the sun comes out, then they're going to head up high into the trees and be foraging up moderately high. So there's no for me, there's no real difference other than, least flycatcher of those fours, I would say, of those four tends to be the one that forages in more open settings. You're most apt to like just spot that one out and about, I would say.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. So hopefully we're all experts on flycatchers now. I know I learned a lot, and I'm definitely going to be buying that book. I didn't know there was a flycatcher guide out there, so that's helpful.
Yeah, that's coming along. Well, that's out, I should say. And then, I think May is their publication date for their second volume, which is going to cover kingbirds and Majorcas. So
Cool
you guys
stuff.
will be largely covered by the next few months here, by the next fall migration anyways.
Alrighty. Well, thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate it, and so does everyone at Alachua Audubon Society. I hope everyone learned a lot, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody. Thanks for having me out, and it was a lot of fun.
Best of luck on your next trip, on your next tour.
Okay. All right. Thanks, you guys. Cheers.
See ya.